Hi, and welcome to the Research Room, a space to make research by the people for the people.
Perfect synergy.
And I will start off with another question. I do like starting off the questions. Have you ever started? Have you ever started? Have you ever stayed up all night? um, I'm curious. Have you pulled an all-nighter? Um, and what about me, right? Have I ever done that? Um, I kind of want to say no. I definitely value sleep, but there are two times where I think it came close. One time, I just felt horrible after that. Um, I mean, I guess both times I felt horrible after that. It's very hard to do. I don't know how people do it. I think some people are just so like naturally able to do it. I'm not able to do it. Anyway, so this whole idea of all-nighters or staying up all night, I highly recommend don't do that for plenty of reasons. Um, One of the biggest reasons is, I mean, sleep is a necessity, right? And I mean, I definitely talked about like how important it is for all of these reasons. I mean, I'll just underline here that it is a necessity, just as much as food is a necessity, just as much as water is a necessity. You need these things to survive. Sleep is also one of those things. So you could, I mean, you literally can die, right? If you don't get enough sleep. So there's that question that I posed. What do you think happens when you stay up all night? There's plenty of things as I sort of alluded to. I'm gonna talk about them here today. Um, but I think maybe even before that, I'm gonna say something that I think is just like as I was reading this article, like it just really dawned on me like how insane it is that like we allow this to happen in science. So because it's a necessity, right? Like you can die, and we know there's so many detrimental effects of not getting enough sleep. Um, you're more likely to have like accidents that are like lethal accidents, and just I mean a whole host of other things like cognitively, like just in your everyday life, like you're not able to communicate as well. You're not able to pay attention, like things like that. So knowing all this science, we still decide to say, hey, we want to make sure you don't get that sleep tonight, just so that we can continue seeing what happens. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, even though we know that it's so negative, we still do it. And I mean, it's of course it's great for the knowledge sake, but like I do wonder, just like, should we be? Especially something as like insane as staying up the entire night. Like that's quite a bit. Um, but okay, so it's not just about these negative consequences though. There's a whole host of other things that happen when you aren't able to sleep. It's not necessarily negative. Just other things about like what you might want or desire, like things like that. Like those things might also shift when you don't sleep for a night. So let me ask you some more questions. What do you think would happen if you didn't sleep all night, as far as like other physical needs? So when it comes to hunger, are you more hungry? Are you less hungry if you didn't get enough sleep? Are you more thirsty? Are you less thirsty? Do you have a desire to eat certain things? Are those things fruits? Are they proteins? Are they other sweets? And so I'll say for basically all of these physical kind of needs, sleep doesn't really impact that. Or I'll have a lot more to say on this, but if you read the article, um, and if you read this article, or if you read a write up of this article, as it's more conventionally done, you might come like off of reading that and being like, oh, like sleep doesn't affect hunger, sleep doesn't affect thirst, sleep doesn't affect what we want to eat. Cool, right? Like that's fine if that's what you get from that. It's not your fault. It's much more how it was written than your fault. But I'm going to say that's not actually true. But I'll hold off on what what more I want to say on that, because there's more things that might or might not be affected by sleep. Um, what about social things? So, would you rather be alone? Would you rather be in the company of friends or with family? If you didn't get sleep last night, would you go on a date? Would you talk to strangers? Would you be willing to at least? Do you think you would want to be cared for? And if you do want to be cared for, who would you want to be cared for by? And so for these social things, we tend to want to be alone. We don't necessarily want to be around friends and family. We don't necessarily want to go on a date or be likely or willing to talk to a stranger. But we do want to be cared for, which is kind of interesting. We want this like space and isolation so that we can sleep, but also we still want to be like cared for by others. So that's an interesting like kind of like mix there. And I guess I'll also say like we would most likely want to be cared for by like a partner rather than a family member. But either way, like it does increase if you aren't able to get sleep from the night before. Do you think you would be willing to do anything for the sake of getting sleep? So would you be willing to pay money? Would you be willing to walk and not just like walk like down a block or something, like walk like miles in order to get some sleep? What do you think? So according to the study, on average, people would want to be able to spend money. People would be willing to spend money in order to get sleep if they didn't get sleep the night before. They would also be willing to walk, which is, I think, pretty crazy, right? Because there's also another finding that like we don't want to engage in physical activities as much, and that makes sense, right? You're tired, you don't want to be doing all that, but we would still be like willing to walk in order to get that sleep. So if that physical activity is gonna like get me into a bed, great, I'll do it. And that's the basic list of findings from this paper. So pretty straightforward, right? People didn't get some sleep, and then they decided, hey, we are more wanting to do these things. So we're more wanting to like be alone, not be around people, to pay money and to walk and things like that. That doesn't necessarily affect hunger and what we want to eat and things like that. Do you believe this? What do you make of this? So I have questions, of course. Like as always, I have questions about this finding, and the questions that I hope you might also think about. So a huge thing with this is that for the study, they had 123 participants. So about 60 people were able to sleep normally, and about 60 people were asked to stay awake the entire night. For that first group of 60, they were able to stay at home. They got their regular 7 to 8 hours of sleep. For people that had to stay up, they had to come to a lab, and they were asked to not sleep for the whole night. All these people were also in Sweden, which like, I mean, not only are they in Sweden, they are from Sweden. So knowing this, right, does this change anything for you? Either the idea that it wasn't that many people, only 60 in each group, is that enough people to compare and to understand an actual pattern of what's happening? And then also the idea that they are in Sweden. Does this matter? Does this change anything about like, like maybe people are just different in Sweden compared to maybe the US or other non-European countries? Is there something special about Sweden? And I'm going to say, I'm not sure that like either of these necessarily should change your mind on like these findings. I think it's such a like strong experiment in the sense of the difference between staying up and sleeping is huge, right? Like that's such a like force in our lives. It changes so many things about our systems and the way we think and things like that. That even if it's not that many people, everything that we found here in this research, they're all very like intuitive kind of things. It makes sense that you don't want to be alone. It makes sense that you don't necessarily crave anything. You just want sleep. It makes sense that you're really willing to do things in order to get that sleep. So since all of these are like pretty intuitive, I would say the evidence that's necessary is not going to be like as high, right? Like the burden of proof isn't so high. Um, so I think it's fine. Like, of course, you'd want to do this again with like a larger amount of people, see if you get the same results. The other thing about Sweden, again, I mean, because this is a basic need, I think it's pretty safe to assume in a lot of ways it's going to be more similar than not, right? There's of course going to be like cultural variations about like maybe your importance of sleep, right? Like how much do you actually care about sleeping? And maybe that actually like makes you more or less tired for that reason. I don't know what it's like in Sweden. I don't even know what it's like in America necessarily. I don't know. It's like there's so much diversity potentially in both of these places that it would be hard to say. But right, like because this is just a necessity, like if you didn't give people food for a day, for 2 days, like that effect is going to be the same. It doesn't matter what country you're in. You might be more or less hungry depending again on like cultural differences, potentially, right? But for the most part, people are going to be hungry. If you don't give people food, they're going to be hungry. If you don't let people sleep, they're going to be tired. Great, right? So I'm going to say, I don't think there's much reason to look into these two things too much. I think it's fine for something like this. The only thing that might change is the extent to which people might agree or disagree with some of these statements. So maybe people in America would really be like willing to give money in order to sleep rather than walk. Maybe in Sweden, there's more of a walking culture. And so it's not too bad. And maybe they wouldn't spend quite as much as Americans. But I think like the general idea like stands, right? So cool. That is the first question is who were these people and does that matter? The second thing is, so one of the findings was that people were not shown to be more or less hungry or more or less thirsty. Does this actually mean that people aren't more or less thirsty or hungry? I don't think so. It's just, it's one of those things about statistics. So there's two main things I'm going to say here. The first thing is everything happens on a range of things. Everything is a continuum of things, right? So, and for everyone, it's going to be slightly different, at least slightly different, if not like really completely different. And so, especially for these like physiological things, like someone might have a very strongly positive response and people might have a really strong negative response. So I'll put that into context of like anxiety. For some people, if they are anxious, their heart will really start racing. For other people, if they are really anxious, their heartbeat might actually really slow down. And that is just a matter of like, what is their stress response? What is that usually like? And for some people, it might be one thing. For other people, it's a different thing. And that's not to say that one is more stressed out than the other. It's just they are different responses and they're both stressed out, they're both anxious. Same thing happens here. For some people, what happens when you don't sleep? I imagine it's really the case that some people, they actually get really hungry for whatever reason. That's just what their body does. For other people, they probably really don't get hungry. Maybe it has nothing to do with sleep. And so it's not, I don't think it's the case that like sleep just doesn't do anything. I think it's probably more the case that it does two potentially extreme things. And because it's just so mixed, it's no like one way for everyone. These results statistically are just going to show like we can't predict whether or not people are going to be hungry or not, at least just based off of if they're sleeping or not sleeping. It probably depends on other things as well as the sleep factor. So I'll also say, so like the statistics that they reported, these are all odds ratios. You don't need to know exactly what that is. You can just think of it as like likelihood. And I think most people understand what likelihood is. How likely is something to happen? Is it more or less likely? And so the number here was 1.84. What that means in this case is that it's almost twice as likely. Almost twice as likely. If it was a 2, then it'd be twice as likely. So almost twice as likely that people would be more hungry if they didn't sleep. But still, that number wasn't quite strong enough, I'll say, not quite reliable enough for us to know that like people actually do tend to, on average, become more hungry. There's going to be, and it seems like probably a lot of people that yes, that is kind of the case, but not enough people for us to say, in general, this is what's going to happen. The flip side of that is when it came to thirst, the number was like 0.5 something. And so in this case, that means that is about half as likely. And so again, that number wasn't quite reliable enough. It wasn't quite strong enough for us to say, hey, like on average, people are half as likely to be thirsty if they're not sleeping. But actually, it probably was the case that like most people felt that way. But then there's other people who had the exact like opposite response, and they were more thirsty. And so it wasn't like patterned enough for us to know. The other thing, and I think this is also a super important point, is that everything that happened in this study, they're only asking, what do you want to? Or like things like that, right? They're never actually seeing if people are actually more hungry, if people are actually more thirsty, and anything else, right? They're only asking for them to just kind of like think about these things, right? What do you think you would be? Do you think you would be wanting food? Things like that. If you had put like food out, if you had put water out, would people that didn't get sleep end up eating more? Would people who didn't end up getting sleep end up drinking more? We don't know. That's not what the study says. And that's fine, right? Like we're allowed to just like think about the perception of things, but we can't actually say anything about the actual behavior. At least given the study, you would need a different study design in order to do that. So we have no idea about if this would actually change anyone's behaviors. We can have thoughts, of course, but as far as the research goes, we don't necessarily know. And so I think one thing that kind of like comes to mind is the idea that like when you're not sleeping, wouldn't you like rather eat sweets or like junk food and like things like that? I think probably that would happen, right? But like maybe you don't necessarily want to. Maybe you think like, oh, like I don't want to have a whole bag of chips, or like I don't necessarily want to have that cupcake or cookies or whatever. And so like in this case, the study shows that like people don't have a preference. They're not more likely to eat these things. But in reality, if you put things in front of them, are they going to? And maybe somebody who's not sleeping has less self-control and also is going to be more likely to eat these things. These are all guesses. There's nothing in the study that actually says yes or no to any of these thoughts. So it's an important point for that reason. We don't want to just automatically apply this to actual behaviors. We don't know about the behaviors. We only know about people's perceptions. Okay, and then my last question is, would this relate in the same way for people that just got like a little bit amount of sleep, as opposed to no sleep? So 0 hours might be very different than somebody who gets 3 hours of sleep, let's say, or maybe 6 hours of sleep, and they're just like very slightly sleep deprived. And I think in general, right, like people aren't necessarily like just staying up all night. It's not all or nothing. People generally get like maybe a little bit of sleep. Maybe they're getting like 2-3 hours of sleep. Maybe they're getting 4 to 5 hours of sleep, but they're consistently not getting enough sleep. And they end up not feeling good because of that. Is that effect the same as somebody who gets like 0 hours of sleep? I don't know. I don't know. And also the study can't tell us. I would be curious about your thoughts. I imagine it's probably similar, but also maybe not, right? Like maybe it's completely different. Maybe in certain ranges. So like I'll give this example of like when people are hungry, right? It's another necessity, right? Another basic need. When people are hungry and they don't eat for, let's say, an hour within hunger, like they're really hungry and they really want to be able to eat. But then if you wait like another, let's say 5 hours or another 10 hours or something kind of weird happens, right? Where like you don't necessarily feel as hungry anymore. Like you don't necessarily feel great, but like you don't necessarily feel as hungry. And so I wonder if there's something similar with this whole sleep thing. And if we can just so easily like generalize what happened in this study compared to what is the normal like sleep deprivation sort of thing, nights and nights of like less than adequate sleep. Like I said, I don't know, but that is a thought to think about. And so if you are trying to put this into context of your own life, it's something to really like consider of like, I mean, I don't actually feel that way. And like, that's not because you're wrong and the research is right. It's just says that the research isn't actually speaking to your circumstances. And that happens all the time. So with that, I'm going to end this episode. If you want to see more on this, there is more to be seen. That is going to be on the website. That's roomforresearch.com. And then there's also social media at Room for Research. Feel free to check us out there. And yeah, until next time, thank you. Bye for now.
With the sun will be perfect.